Hello there. So, welcome again to one of these quarantine homilies. Um, Today's reading is again from the Gospel of John, as our most Easter season readings, and kind of a little tricky to preach on these. Every year it's a little, these are the most. The Gospel of John is the most symbolic, the most poetic of all the Gospels, and um, nothing is very clear. And so today's gospel is an example of that, where Jesus is saying, the one who is from above is above all. The one who is of the earth is earthly and speaks of earthly things. But the one from heaven is above all of that. He testifies to what he has seen and heard, yet no one accepts his testimony. And it goes on. But it's that kind of talk. And what I take from that is this gospel is about the primacy of the spiritual over the material. The one who is from heaven is above all. The one who is earthly speaks of earthly things. Oftentimes I think we get it switched around. We think that the material world is more real than the spiritual world, when actually it's the opposite, and you can see that with just regular common sense, that everything that we can see, feel, and touch in the material world had its origin first in the world of spirit. Every invention that someone made up was at one point just an idea in their head, long before they put the idea to paper and eventually crafted it into something. Every social movement was an idea in people's hearts, long before it came to be, before it took traction. And likewise, every war, every conflict, by the time you see the guns on the battlefield, you're already kind of arriving late to the party. It's yesterday's news, because that war had its origin in the hearts and minds of people long before it manifested itself in the physical world. So the spiritual world is primary. There's just so many obvious examples of how that plays out. And so by the time we see stuff in the material world, we are seeing the last hurrah, the last reverberations of the world of the spirit. Somebody told me once, and I thought this was fascinating, that when you look up at the stars, what you see is not the stars as they are now. Because light takes a long time to travel. If a star is 100 light years away, what you see when you look at that star is how that star looked 100 years ago. Because that's how long it takes to travel 100 light years, is 100 years. So that star could very well have burned out 100 years ago, and you're still looking at it, because what you're seeing is a delay, because of how long it takes for light to travel. And that's kind of the way it works with the material world and the spiritual world. Things have their origin in the spiritual world, and but by the time it reaches the material world, we're already a step behind. And so, but it's very interesting, though, that some people are very attuned to the world of the spirit. We're attuned to the world of ideas and to the heart. And when they try to articulate those, people that are more rooted in the material world are very hostile to that. I often think of examples in the corporate world or at work, where they're always touting these best practices. Oh my gosh, if I had a nickel for every time somebody said best practices, best practices are the answer to yesterday's problem. You know, by the time you're reading about best practices, they're not best practices anymore. You know, they were yesterday's best practices. And so what you really need to be paying attention to is emerging practices. You know, that's the world of the Spirit. Those are the things that are going to address today's problems. This reading also reminds me of Plato, the philosopher Plato, and his allegory of the cave, where he talks about a cave, and there's prisoners in a cave, and there's objects outside of the cave, and there's a fire that is casting shadows on the wall inside of the cave, and the prisoners inside the cave think the shadows are the real deal. But one day a prisoner escapes from the cave, and he realizes that what they're looking at is really the shadows, not the real deal. And he has a hard time convincing them that what they're seeing is a shadow, is a reflection of the real. And that was Jesus' problem. You know, he said, you know, the people who are, you know, from above, the world of the Spirit, who are attuned to the world of the Spirit, testify to what they see and to what they know, and yet the world does not accept their testimony, because the world is about the material, what you can see, what you can touch. They don't always have time for what is emerging from the subtle movements of the Spirit. And yet everybody who is a success in our world is a success because they knew how to do that. They could read the signs of the times before the times. You know, my dad once used to do a bunch of leather work, and the leather company he would order his stuff from was a company called Tandy Leather Company. And they would always send him letters saying, you know, do you want to buy into the company? And he would always, you know, not do it. Well, Tandy started making radios. And then they became another company called Radio Shack. And he kicks himself all the time because he didn't see that. You know, he didn't see the subtle movements of things before they occurred. And so I think this reading is really about the gospel invitation, is to pay less attention to the world we can see, feel, touch, hear, and to pay more attention to the real world from which all of that emanates, the world of the Spirit that is primary. So those are thoughts on today's gospel. Have a good day or night whenever you're seeing this.